Life was full of trials and small victories, like a series of inevitable whirlpools and quiet harbors that sometimes pressed me against the rocks, then left me the opportunity to breathe deeply. The loss of my parents, which happened when I was very young, like a hole in a ship, was held for a long time only by the thin threads of a child's faith. The pain of this loss was bitter and deep, like a scar that would never heal, but I was already used to not noticing it every day. I was saved by my neighbors, an elderly couple, the Parkers. They appeared in my life like a warm, caring shadow, protecting me from the cruel and indifferent blows of the world. The Parkers were old-school people, simple and kind. Their tired faces, covered with fine wrinkles, always shone with the light of kindness, like the lights of candles in the dark. They welcomed me into their cozy, modest home, where every detail breathed history. They didn't need to explain love or care to me, they just lived it, radiating this warmth like a sun in a cold sky. Their relationship to me seemed even more parental than their parents once had. They were like grandparents who laughed at my jokes, told endless stories from their youth, and always supported me when it seemed that the whole world was turning against me. We didn't live richly, but we had a value that no amount of money could measure. The Parkers gave me the feeling that I was needed, that there was meaning in every morning sun, in the smell of homemade bread, in evening gatherings around a small stove. We shared not only modest meals, but also shared dreams, and that was enough to make life seem real. They taught me to see happiness in simple things, in warm milk in the morning, in the rustle of leaves outside the window, in the calm breathing of the house. When I turned 19, I was already full of ideas about the future. The Parkers always dreamed that I would go to college and find my way. They often said that I was destined to achieve something. Their eyes shone with pride at these words. And suddenly, one terrible day, when they went shopping in the city, the irreparable happened. A sudden accident ended their lives as suddenly as the autumn wind rips the last leaves from a tree. It seemed to me that the world had collapsed again, the support that had just been restored had disappeared again. They left me some money, accumulated with love and hope, so that I could continue my studies, and my home, our home, where every corner kept memories warmed by their care. But the house now seemed alien, as if all the memories had disappeared from it, and only the pain and the shadow of their smiles remained. I sold it and bought a small apartment in the city, next to the college where I planned to study financial management. It seemed like I was finally walking my own path, with a clear plan and dreams that they helped me grow. The classes were not easy, but I wanted to work, learn more and more, and with each course I completed, I felt more confident. But despite the successes and the constant environment of people, the evening noise of the big city could not drown out the quiet feeling of loneliness that grew at night. One day, at a friend's party, in a cycle of laughter and conversation, I met Peter. His appearance was like a bright splash of color in a black and white film. He was noisy, contagiously cheerful, his laughter attracted attention like a light in the dark, and no one seemed to be able to resist his energy. We bumped into each other by accident. He spilled my drink, and I snapped back, more out of surprise than real annoyance. But instead of apologizing, he just smiled, as if he thought the incident was something funny. My fault. Let me make it up to you. What have you been drinking? What is it? He asked with a slight grin that didn't contain a hint of embarrassment. And before I could answer, Peter shouted cheerfully and ordered us 2 large mugs of beer. This was his whole attitude to life, without ceremony, without excessive pathos, simply and with kind irony. We talked all night, not noticing how fast time was flying. Our conversation was light as a breath, touching on both serious topics and the most trivial things. We both loved old movies and hated sushi with equal tenacity. I didn't want to leave the party. From the very first hours of meeting him, I felt that there was something native in him that I missed so much. When we started dating, there were no bright, memorable gestures in our relationship, only simple but warm moments, evening walks, the noise of the TV and the silence in which I felt comfortable. One day, while we were watching TV, He suddenly pulled a ring out of his pocket. "Marry me," he said, clutching the ring so tightly, as if he was afraid I would refuse. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was him, my completely imperfect Peter. Stifling a laugh, I replied that, of course, I agreed that I will marry this big fool. The wedding didn't change us much, but it gave us that easy confidence that we now have each other. We still lived in my small apartment, on a noisy city street, but now the loneliness was gone, giving way to quiet happiness from dinners together, conversations before going to bed, where every day ended with quiet confessions and laughter. "Thank you. I really appreciate how hospitable you have been," I replied, feeling sincere gratitude and warm affection for Mr. and Mrs. Scott. Our weekend visits became an invariable part of life, a tradition in which there was so much warmth and comfort that the heart was filled with peace. We gathered in their quiet garden, under the spreading branches of the trees, and had a barbecue, chatting leisurely about everything and nothing. It was so easy and natural to share these moments with them. It seemed that life had found some new meaning, where quiet joys are important, not noisy achievements, but quiet joys, the aroma of fresh coffee, the soft sounds of their conversations, long conversations about the past, which they lived with the same honesty and fortitude as our real everyday life. But then everything changed. Jack was recalled on a business trip for a whole year, and it became clear to me that with his departure, the peace I was used to would be disturbed. It was an incredible chance for his career, the very chance for which people are willing to sacrifice time and effort. We said goodbye with a little worry, but still with the hope that the year would pass quickly, and we would be able to enjoy our quiet evenings again, returning to what we had managed to build together. However, the timing of his departure turned out to be terribly inappropriate. Immediately after he left, Mr. and Mrs. Scott's health began to deteriorate, and it happened rapidly, like a sudden winter storm. One evening, when I was about to go to bed, the bell rang. On the other end of the line, I heard Mrs. Scott's trembling voice, full of anxiety and fatigue. "Laura, I hate to bother you, but I could really use your help. Mr. Scott is unwell," she said, barely able to keep her voice from getting excited. At that moment, without hesitation, I packed my bag and went to the hospital, where he had already been admitted. In the suburbs, with its quiet streets and familiar houses, I suddenly saw this world from the other side. The house where comfort and tranquility used to reign now looked strange and deserted. The reserved and energetic Mrs. Scott, always so collected, seemed depressed and fragile as never before. Mr. Scott, formerly the mainstay of the whole family, now lay surrounded by tubes and machines, his once confident voice barely audible amid the noises of hospital equipment. At such moments, the past seemed to become too vivid, painful, and it was then that I decided that I would do everything to help. From that day on, I became fully involved in their lives, as they once became a part of mine. I took on simple but necessary responsibilities, cooking, cleaning the house, looking after the little things so that Mrs. Scott could focus on taking care of her husband. In the evenings, after long and quiet dinners, I sat next to Mr. Scott and read books to him. He often closed his eyes without waiting for the end of the chapter, but each time he whispered softly, "Thank you, Laura." His voice, although weak, was still filled with the old kindness. "It makes me happy," I replied, gently squeezing his hand, hoping that he felt at least some of the gratitude that I felt for them over the years of caring. One evening, when I was chopping vegetables for dinner, Mrs. Scott sat across from me on the kitchen chair, her eyes glistening with accumulated excitement. She was silent for a long time, and then, twisting her hands as if searching for words, finally said, "Laura, I do not know how to say this. We're kind of in a difficult situation." Her voice was trembling, and her gaze was directed away. I put down the knife and turned to her, holding my breath. She continued, "Mr. Scott has always been the one who provided for our home, and now, we are barely making ends meet." I felt this weight on my shoulders as well. Mrs. Scott looked at me with a slight shyness and, lowering her voice, added, "I'm so embarrassed to suggest this, but maybe you could consider renting out your apartment." It would help us get through this difficult period. Without thinking for a moment, I said firmly, "Of course, Mrs. Scott. I'll take care of it right now." Gratitude flashed in her eyes, mixed with obvious relief. The apartment was rented out pretty quickly, and every month I sent Mrs. Scott money for rent, trying to include enough to cover both groceries and all the necessary bills. It wasn't easy. The trips to and from the city became tedious, took time and effort, but in my mind I just reminded myself that a real family never leaves their own, especially at such times. Every day I felt more connected to this house, when now only muffled voices sounded. The old clock on the wall measured the steady passage of time, and even the slight creak of the floor seemed to me an important detail in the symphony of their everyday life. Every time I handed Mrs. Scott money, her eyes filled with warm gratitude. "You are a godsend, Laura, our salvation," she repeated with trepidation in her voice, as if she could not believe that I was still here. "This is what a family does," I replied with a slight smile, trying to hold her hands in mine a little longer so that she would understand. "They are not strangers to me." The night sometimes seemed endless. I lay in the guest room, listening to the distant sounds of the city that the wind brought, and felt the silence of this house fill my heart. The silence could be heavy, especially at times when thoughts of loneliness and fear came with unexpected force. But at such moments, calls from Jack became a salvation. His voice became my refuge. The connection was far from perfect. I could barely hear his words through the noise and interference, but it was enough to keep me going. When Lauren, Mrs. Scott's daughter from her first marriage, appeared in the house, her unexpected presence seemed to bring with it an icy wind that made its way through the cracks of the old windows and made the walls tremble with tension. There was a restrained, almost palpable coldness in her gaze, and every word she uttered echoed in the air with a hidden cruelty. We hardly knew each other. Jack mentioned her in passing several times, mentioning that she had always had a difficult relationship with her parents, but he never went into details. With her arrival, something had changed in the Scott house, something invisible but felt by everyone. Her demeanor seemed harsh and domineering, as if she was the mistress of the house, not going to restrain herself for the sake of someone else's comfort. It was hard to believe that this young woman, with her ice-cold gaze and proud bearing, could be the daughter of Mrs. Scott, who radiated kindness and care on ordinary days. I knew that my days would now be full not only of work, but also of trying to keep the peace in a house already fragile due to Mr. Scott's illness. Mr. Scott was getting better, then worse, and better again, but Lauren's presence only increased the tension. She appeared in the room suddenly, like a shadow. Her footsteps were barely audible, but each time her presence was felt acutely, like a knife stuck into the delicate canvas of a quiet life. She began to behave as if she had lived here for a long time, moving things without hesitation, taking books from the shelves, leaving her handkerchiefs and small things in the living room, as if declaring her territory. One evening, when I was clearing the table after a late dinner, Mr. Scott seemed to gather his last strength and motioned me over to him. His voice was faint, barely discernible, but there was an alarm in it that could not be ignored. "Laura," he said with difficulty, "you need to keep an eye on Lauren. She's not a good person." His words sounded so unexpected that I couldn't help but feel my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. I nodded, trying to suppress my growing fear. "I understand, Mr. Scott. I'll be careful," I promised, although at that moment I had no idea what kind of danger Lauren might be hiding. The answer to this question came quickly. One morning, when I went into the kitchen to make breakfast, Lauren was already there. She was standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee in her hands, and when she saw me, she gave me a look full of hidden contempt. "So that we can understand each other," she began with a sharp tone, "I'm not here to play the role of a maid or cook for someone." Her words echoed in the room like a cold wave, and despite my best efforts, I felt my heart begin to contract with resentment. She continued to look at me as if I were an uninvited guest in her own mother's kitchen, and with her icy gaze it became clear that I was a stranger here. "Okay, Lauren," I replied calmly, trying not to betray my feelings. I've been taking care of everything so far and I can keep doing it. I tried to offer a compromise, hoping that this way I could at least soften her mood a little and create a calm environment that Mr. and Mrs. Scott needed so much during these difficult times. Lauren just snorted, glancing over her shoulder as if my words were completely unimportant. I'm not planning on lifting a finger, she snapped, her eyes glittering with some kind of challenge, in which I discerned something unkind. This is Mom's house, after all. From that day on, she made sure that her presence was felt everywhere, and not in the best way. She ordered takeaways exclusively for herself and her mother, leaving empty containers on the table, as if implying that it was my responsibility to clean up after her. There was a subtle, barely perceptible cruelty in her every gesture. Her attitude was painful, but I did not allow myself to speak out or complain, bearing in mind Mr. Scott's serious condition. After all, taking care of him and Mrs. Scott remained my main task, and I hoped that I could keep the world at least for their peace of mind. On one of those dark, cold evenings when the house seemed particularly silent, Mrs. Scott suddenly invited me to sit down and have dinner with them. "Laura, why don't you join us for dinner?" Her voice sounded softer than usual. There was a rare warmth in it, like a reflection of those good times when the house was full of light and comfort. I was about to respond by thanking her, when Lauren suddenly intervened, giving her mother a warning look. "Laura has been busy all day," she said, pretending to care about my well-being, but there was a hidden dislike in her tone. "She probably prefers to eat later." Her words sounded concerned, almost sincere, but I realized that her true message was quite clear to me: I am not welcome at this table. After that, the days became especially difficult. Lauren seemed to fill the house with her cold, hostile energy, and this could not but affect all the inhabitants. My responsibilities doubled, because I had to clean up not only for Mr. and Mrs. Scott, but also for Lauren, who left things in a complete mess, deliberately creating a feeling of not being comfortable. She whispered to her mother at night, often closing the door to the room behind her, but their quiet conversations came through the thin walls. I began to notice that Mrs. Scott had changed. Her old gentleness had disappeared, her smiles had become less frequent, her words had become colder and shorter. A few weeks later, Mr. Scott passed away. His departure was quiet, almost imperceptible, but the house was empty so that every breath, every step along the corridors seemed out of place. The funeral was a somber and restrained event, to which Jack flew in just in time to say goodbye to the man who was an example of patience and strength for both of us. It was the first time I'd seen Jack in months. His presence next to me was a relief, as if a blanket had covered me from the incessant cold. After the service, we were left alone, and he finally asked me, carefully looking into my eyes, "How are you? How was it while I was gone?" There was genuine concern in his tone, which I tried to avoid in our short phone conversations, not wanting to burden him with my problems. "Okay, everything was fine," I replied, forcing a smile that I hoped he would take for the truth. But I saw a shadow of doubt in Jack's eyes, and he narrowed his eyes and added, carefully examining me, "Are you sure? You look a little exhausted." His words came crashing down on me like an exposure that I was afraid of, but at the same time I was waiting for. Jack didn't need to know the truth about everything that was going on at the Scott house. He was just busy helping out here, you know, I replied with an uncertain smile, lowering my eyes to avoid his scrutinizing gaze. It wasn't the right time to unload the whole truth, but it was getting harder and harder to hide the accumulated tension. As soon as Jack left, Lauren's caring sister mask collapsed like brittle glass, breaking into small pieces, which immediately exposed her true attitude towards me and everything that was happening here. The dynamics in the house have changed completely. Mrs. Scott, who had always been kind and calm before, seemed to have withdrawn into her grief like a clam in its shell. Her face seemed to me like a marble mask, and her words were icy orders, uttered with a barely perceptible note of contempt. She didn't talk to me anymore, didn't share her feelings, didn't thank me for my help. She only gave orders without looking into my eyes, and her detachment gradually turned me into a faceless servant in my own house. Meanwhile, Lauren seemed to be enjoying this new, heightened atmosphere. She took the place of the hostess in the house, giving instructions and disposing of things as if she were the main person here. But her power extended beyond the common spaces. One night I woke up to hear soft footsteps in my room. Lauren was standing by my closet, sorting through my things with a casual unhurriedness, as if she was looking for something that belonged to her. She did not apologize, was not embarrassed, but only shot me a look full of contempt and almost contemptuous irony before walking out, leaving me with my heart racing with vague anxiety. And that was just the beginning. Soon, her intrusions into my personal life became regular. She barged in without knocking, rummaging through my things as if she had every right to do so. One afternoon, I returned from a walk in the garden, trying to find peace for a moment, and accidentally noticed an old box thrown among the bushes. As I approached, I carefully opened its lid and felt my heart stop. There were my personal belongings, watches, jewelry, even underwear and several dresses casually draped over the edge. These things couldn't have been here by accident. There was some malicious intent in it. The rage that erupted rose like a wave, stronger every moment, until it completely overwhelmed me. I grabbed the box, hugging it tightly to my chest, and with my breathing accelerating, I headed into the living room, where I found Lauren sitting in her usual calm, relaxed way, as if this place really belonged to her. There was fury in my eyes, and I felt my voice tremble with anger and blurted out, "What the hell, Lauren? You can't just throw my stuff away like that." Lauren, without raising her eyebrows, just laughed coldly, her laughter echoing around the room like sharp shards of ice. "Please live here," she said in a tone in which subtle venom was mixed with faint hospitality. "You're just a guest, and not very welcome, to be honest. Perhaps it would be better for you to spend time in the garden, or even better, somewhere far away, because you're nothing more than a useless freeloader." Her eyes were looking straight at me, sparkling with a kind of grim satisfaction. I felt her words digging into my soul like knives, leaving behind only bleeding wounds full of pain and humiliation. Trying to find support, I turned to Mrs. Scott, who had just entered the room and witnessed our conversation. "Mrs. Scott," my voice broke, and I looked pleadingly into her face, hoping that she would understand. "Please tell her that she can't treat me like that." But her eyes swept over me with an empty, detached look, as if I were an empty place, and her face remained cold, as if carved out of stone. "This is Lauren's house," she said clearly, almost mechanically, and there was no shadow of doubt in her voice, no sign of the old kindness. "She's right, Laura. Maybe it's really time for you to find another place to live." Her words hit like a hammer, shattering the last shards of illusions that I was still a part of this family. I froze, clutching the box tighter to my chest, unable to believe that the house that I considered my own, which I filled with care and devotion, was becoming a stranger right before my eyes. But what was most depressing was that I didn't stay here for myself, but for the promise I made to Mr. Scott in his last moments. "Take care of her, Laura, don't let Lauren ruin everything." These words rang in my mind every time I wanted to give up and leave, give up. Every day Mrs. Scott became more and more like Lauren. Her once kind gaze, full of understanding and gratitude, was now cold, and her words cut like shards of glass. One evening, when I was clearing the table after dinner, she threw a sarcastic remark in my direction, which hid the same cool mockery as in her daughter's words. "You're just sitting here doing nothing, aren't you?" She sounded annoyed, as if my efforts were negligible. "I'm doing everything I can to keep order," I replied, trying to stay calm and not let my voice break, although everything inside was shaking with resentment. She narrowed her eyes flashing with cold mockery. "With all my might, you say? Did I really let myself be deceived into thinking that you were really useful?" She turned around without waiting for an answer and left, leaving me in an empty room, gripped by a heavy silence, like a bitter taste on my lips. I wasn't a freeloader. On the contrary, I rented out my apartment, forwarding almost all of Mrs. Scott's income, not to mention the fact that I was responsible for most of the household chores that Lauren easily avoided. She only took, without giving anything in return, living on her mother's pension and constantly mocking me, as if enjoying every moment of my vulnerability. At night, when the house was silent, her voice carried through the corridors, loud enough for me to hear her every word through the thin walls. "I can't imagine what my brother could see in you," she teased me, putting even more venom into her words each time. I bit my tongue, swallowing the accumulated anger and pain, reminding myself over and over again of the promise I made at the bedside of a dying man. The atmosphere in the house became more and more unbearable, filled with pent-up tension, cold hostility that permeated the air. Every day I felt this intense weight pressing down on me, like the walls of a house that had once been cozy and warm were now shrinking, turning into cold blocks of stone. One evening, after returning from work earlier than usual, I involuntarily witnessed a conversation that turned my reality around and made all the feelings that had developed before finally take shape. Quietly, like a ghost, I entered the house, trying not to attract attention to myself. But as I approached the living room, I heard a conversation in which every remark sounded like a thunderclap, every phrase struck like lightning. The voices of Lauren and Mrs. Scott came to me like muffled whispers, but with each word the meaning of their discussion became more and more obvious to me. Standing around the corner, I froze, afraid to even breathe, so as not to give myself away. "We need her to sell this apartment," Lauren said. There was an icy greed in her voice, distinct, almost threatening. "Do you have any idea how we could use this money? It would have changed everything." Her words seemed to burn through the air. There was a moment of silence, but then Mrs. Scott answered, and her voice was both disappointed and greedy. "Yes, but how do we convince her? Laura is not stupid enough to give the money away just like that." Lauren snorted derisively, and her next sentence slithered through the air like a snake aiming at its prey. "Leave it to me, Mom. I can talk her into it. I will show all my best manners to look nice and caring. Once she signs the contract, we can finally live the life we deserve." Her words made my throat go dry, and my heart froze with fear and pain. I felt the world crumble around me. They planned to take away my last foothold, the only thing I could consider my financial protection. A blow in the gut, crushing and painful, made me recoil, and I barely refrained from giving myself away. Fear bound me like chains of ice, and at that moment I realized that I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't let them destroy my last hopes of independence so easily. Quickly and silently, I slipped into my room. My hands were shaking as I packed my things, and my heart was beating as if trying to escape from my chest. I knew that with every moment I spent in this house, disaster was inevitably approaching. Without bothering to say goodbye, I chose only the most necessary things for myself, packed a small bag, clutching it tightly, as if it were my last anchor of salvation. Slipping out the back door, I went to the road and called a taxi to the nearest train station. While I was sitting on the train, desperately looking out the window at the flashing landscapes, my thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind. Will I be able to explain everything to Jack? Will he understand? The fear of his possible reaction and the painful uncertainty of his support filled me with bitterness and confusion. The landscapes outside the window merged into a solid gray stripe, and I felt my hopes merge into an endless stream along with it. But despite the nagging doubts, the fear of what awaits me if I stay was stronger. Upon arrival at Jack's house, I stopped in front of his door, realizing that inside I was scared and anxious like never before. When the door opened and Jack stood in front of me, I noticed how his face changed from relief at the sight of me to shock and concern. His gaze swept over my figure, stopping at the small bag in my hand. "Laura, what are you doing here?" His voice trembled with surprise and alarm. He stepped aside, inviting me in, but I hesitated. It seemed that from the moment I left, my confidence began to melt. "No, Jack, it's not okay." "It's not okay at all," I said, and my voice sounded almost broken. He gently took me by the shoulder, leading me to the couch, his face now reflecting growing anxiety. "Talk to me, baby." "What happened?" His voice was full of tenderness. He was sincerely trying to figure out what had upset me. This time I didn't hide the truth. With every word, I told him everything: how the atmosphere in the house was getting heavier every day after Lauren returned, how Mrs. Scott was getting colder, and how they were plotting to force me to sell my apartment. Speaking about it out loud, I couldn't hold back my emotions any longer. They literally burst out. As I continued my story, Jack's face darkened and his gaze became more and more stern. When I finished, his fists were clenched and his jaw was clenched tightly. It was as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" he asked, his voice at once filled with deep concern and a slight tinge of disappointment. "I thought I could handle it, that I could figure it out on my own," I admitted, feeling stupid for my naivety. Jack abruptly stood up and began pacing the room, as if trying to find a way to vent his anger. "Laura, you shouldn't have handled this alone." His voice was harsh and firm, as if he was both angry and shocked at the same time. "I can't believe my mother and Lauren did this to you." He grabbed the phone, and my heart beat faster with unexpected excitement as I watched him dial his mother's number. When she answered, barely letting the phone ring twice, Jack didn't give her a chance to say a word. I couldn't hear what she was saying in response, but it was clear from his stern, piercing gaze and tense shoulders that the conversation was going to be stormy. "That's enough, Mom." His voice sounded harsh and determined, and there was not a drop of the old humility or indecision left in it. "This has to stop. I know everything. I won't tolerate it if Lauren doesn't leave and if you don't start treating Laura with respect. We're done. No help, no money, nothing." Jack's voice was adamant, like a steel sword lowered in a sign of completion. He did not leave his mother the slightest hope of objections or explanations. A sharp exchange ensued. On the other end of the line, Mrs. Scott probably did not expect such harshness from her own son. Her indignation rolled like waves against his resolve, but Jack remained adamant, his words like a stone wall against which her arguments and accusations flew. Soon, after another harsh statement, there was silence on the phone. Jack gripped the phone even tighter, his fingers turned white with tension, and he exhaled heavily and spoke again with relentless firmness. "Good. If that's your choice, Mom, then you just made mine." With that, he hung up the phone and turned to me. The anger that had been bubbling up in him a second ago was replaced by gentleness, and his expression became as calm as after the last storm. "It's just the two of us now, baby, but that's all we need," he said, pulling me to him. I felt his hand gently wrap around my shoulder, giving me a sense of security that I hadn't known for a long time. His warmth, his confidence, became for me the support that I missed so much. Leaning towards him, I whispered softly, "Now it's just us," feeling all the truth and peace in these words. We knew that the world around us could collapse, that we were left without support, but it was somehow even a relief. Now there was no doubt that we were building our own future. We stayed up late discussing how we would cope with the new conditions, without the constant shadow of interference from his mother and Lauren. Jack spoke with firm confidence about how we would manage our affairs, how I would be able to work remotely, and he would get a second job until we were finally settled. We made plans, dreamed, and in every word he said, I felt the strength, the inner determination that now supported me. "You and me against the whole world, right?" Jack smiled, and this smile resonated in me with calm confidence, filling my soul with light. I smiled back at him, and all the worries, fears of the unknown, receded into the background, like autumn leaves blown away by a gust of wind. The next few days were busy, filled with new tasks and preparations for a new life. I contacted my superiors and arranged for a transfer to a remote job. Fortunately, they met me halfway, and this allowed me to feel that my career remains in place, that my efforts will not be wasted. Jack was there, helping in everything, supporting at every step. Together we took my things out of storage and set up a small office corner in one of the rooms of his apartment. It wasn't ideal. The room was cramped, the furniture was old and scratched in places, but for us this place became a symbol of a new freedom, free from past pressure and interference. One day, when I had already entered the rhythm of work, a call interrupted my concentration. Mrs. Scott's number appeared on the screen. I froze, as if a cold wind had swept over my skin. When I picked up the phone, I heard her voice, which had seemed calm to me before, almost comforting, but now it was sharp and piercing, resembling an ice razor. "Laura, why didn't I get the money for this month? You know that we depend on it." Her voice was harsh, cold, and filled with demands. I could hear the desperation rolling through her words, the sense of entitlement to my help, as if it were something taken for granted. Suppressing my indignation with difficulty, I answered calmly, trying to hide the resentment that flared up. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Scott, but after all that you and Lauren have said and done to me, do you still expect me to support you?" I said, sounding more surprised than angry. In the background, I heard Lauren's harsh voice. "She's ungrateful. Make her transfer the money." Her words cut through my ears like an unhealed wound, reminding me of the contempt they felt for me. I took a deep breath to calm my anger, which was rising like a storm inside me. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Scott, but I don't support people who treat me like that," I finally said, feeling a hardness in my words that hadn't been there before. There was silence on the other end of the line. I imagined Mrs. Scott sitting there, shocked, perhaps for the first time to hear rejection from me. She faltered, and finally her voice rang out again, softer now, with a desperate note. "But we are family," she said, as if hoping that this would be enough to melt my heart. "No family treats each other like that," I replied calmly, feeling as if this short sentence ended our entire conversation, severing the thread that still remained between us. I slowly hung up the phone without giving her a chance to answer. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of liberation, but with it came the realization that only Jack and I were truly left in this world now. Jack seemed to sense my excitement and was right there, hugging me tightly by the shoulders. "You did the right thing, Laura. It's time for them to learn to stand on their own 2 feet, he said, his voice firm and confident. His support gave me strength, and I felt completely safe in his arms. Soon after, life gave us an unexpected surprise. I felt that something had changed, and a few days later I found out that I was pregnant. This news, like a bright ray of light, illuminated our future, filling it with warmth and new hope. Jack and I were delighted. This little man, whom we were now expecting, seemed to connect us even more. Together we decided that it was time to make it all over again, without the past, without what was holding us back. And so, standing in the morning sun, we discussed our plans. We decided to sell my apartment and buy a small house in the suburbs, where we can start life from scratch. We have chosen an area with good schools and green streets, where our future child will be able to grow up in a calm and happy environment. Shortly after Jack and I completed the move and settled into our new cozy home, another call from Mrs. Scott brought me back to the whirlwind of the past. I slowly picked up the phone, and the voice on the other end sounded like never before. Its hardness disappeared, leaving room for despair and barely perceptible pleading. "Laura." "I made a mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling like the voice of a man drowned in loneliness and remorse, begging for salvation. She continued, her words breaking through a wave of shame and bitterness. "Lauren forced me to sell the house, took all the money and left me with nothing. I don't have a roof over my head anymore. Can I come to you with Jack?" Her question, uttered with such hopelessness, as if a cold whirlwind had burst into my heart, like a test of determination, an echo of the past, calling for a return to the path once traveled. I was silent for a moment, trying to remain firm, suppressing the rising wave of mixed feelings. "Mrs. Scott, you chose this path when you decided to side with Lauren, when you rejected us and our house." My voice sounded calm, but inside everything turned upside down. I knew Jack would support me in any decision, but it didn't take the weight off my mind. I know I made mistakes, Laura. You are welcome. I was hoping that you could forgive the old woman who lost everything because of her wrong choice. Her voice was hoarse, and there were tears in it. I sighed, trying to suppress the pity that was burning inside me, but with it came memories of the words, pain, and neglect that Jack and I had suffered all these years. Mrs. Scott, I forgave you a long time ago. But that doesn't mean I can let you back into my life. The past cannot be changed, and you will have to live with the consequences of your actions, just as we had to deal with your decisions. Having said that, I felt a strange but liberating sense of completion envelop my heart. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and I plucked up the courage to end the conversation. Before she could reply, I slowly hung up the phone, feeling the weight fall off my shoulders every moment, like the sun coming out after a long bad weather. I blocked her number, knowing that with this decision we have started a new chapter, and now nothing will disturb the peace that we have achieved. Soon Jack and I bought a house, bright, cozy, with a wide garden, where on summer evenings we dreamed of future games and laughter of our child. One lazy Thursday morning, as I was flipping through the newspaper over my morning coffee, a headline on one of the pages caught my attention: "Local woman arrested for major fraud." My heart skipped a beat, and my fingers gripped the edge of the page as I recognized her, Lauren, handcuffed, with a faded, burned-out expression on her face that had long since ceased to remind me of anything. I called Jack, feeling a wave of shock and a strange feeling wash over me. "Jack, look at this." He walked over and looked at the newspaper carefully. His face remained serious, disappointment flashed in his eyes, but not surprise. "Yes, I can't say that this is a surprise, but a lot is worth accepting," he calmly remarked. I nodded softly, feeling like in this confession, that she had made a choice, and now she was paying for it. The final piece that we both lacked was coming. We both knew that life goes on as usual, that sooner or later everyone gets what they deserve. After this news, we heard from friends that Mrs. Scott now lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and pay off the debts that Lauren had left. At one of the summer barbecues in our backyard, one of Jack's old friends, Frank, approached him, exchanging news. "Have you heard about your mom?" Frank asked as they stood at the grill and Jack turned over the burgers on the grill. His voice was sympathetic, but Jack's eyes reflected a sense of completion, as if he had already let go of all this weight. "Yes, I heard," Jack sighed. His voice was calm. There was both sadness and inner acceptance in it. "She's chosen her path, Frank. It's difficult, but it's true." Frank nodded, and his eyes became understanding. Further conversation turned to lighter topics: sports, work, everyday worries. Now nothing darkened our days, and the joy of the new life that opened up before us overwhelmed us with every moment. When Kelly was born, everything changed. She became our new universe. Her every dream and every laugh filled the house with warm light, erasing the old shadows of the past. Our dreams and priorities have shifted, focusing on how to create a better future for her, on giving her the life that we ourselves were once deprived of. In the silence of the night, standing by her crib, we watched her sleeping peacefully, her tiny fingers relaxed, her face calm, as if the world around had never known troubles and worries. "Can you believe she's ours?" I whispered, stroking her little hand, feeling infinitely happy. Jack hugged me, his voice low but breaking with emotion. "She's perfect, Laura. Just perfect." Every day we admired Kelly, her first smiles, her funny and gentle babble, and everything seemed to be permeated with happiness. And gradually the past became just a distant, forgotten memory that we left behind, opening up to new, bright days, where our little joys became the main basis for future memories, for the story that we created for her and for us, the story of our family, full of love and joy.